Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Mike Johnson. I'm a DevOps security engineer, and part of my job functions in the sort of security tooling space, and obviously validating tools before we implement them, and even just comparing against our current tool sets. One of the issues presented with this was, as the technology advances at such an exponential rate, it's very difficult to justify a change for maybe 2 or 3 features. So I developed a framework that would aid in a proof of concept for security tools. And the rationale behind this is, there's been, in the past 18 months, a few cybersecurity companies that have hit the unicorn status in that they've been valued at over $1 billion. And this just means that there's going to be far more funding in the future. And where there's money, there's obviously innovation. The issue posed to a security team, however, is if you become stagnant, you could be missing out on a huge number of either benefits or, reducing your attack surface or risk. One of the issues as well is, if you look at tools that, from an infrastructure perspective, such as Ansible Tower or something like that, the worst case scenario is engineers that have to work around some of the nuances of the tooling. When you're looking at security tools, they can be the sort of difference between you knowing that there's someone in your network and not knowing. Not necessarily these sort of toolings. It could be something that looks at company policies like IAM. A lot of proof of concepts that you run with vendors will be probably a couple of weeks to give you that feel for it. So the scenario I present is, you've logged in to your email, you've received a LinkedIn message, and it tends to be a cold call from some security vendor that is offering you the next generation of machine learning, artificial intelligence-backed security. Sounds fantastic. Now, you've gone through the motions with them, you've been speaking to them, and they've given you the demo. Now, for something like HIDS or an XDR platform, they'll likely show you a live demonstration of the attacks. It'll show you a very controlled environment where, here we can monitor this, we're looking for lateral movement from containers and things like that. And you can take their word for it, and you can obviously see in is believing. However, there's always a side of caution, especially if you're working with a small startup or a very sort of small company, in terms of there might be limitations to the technology that aren't immediately obvious. So you're looking to fill this gap, and you go through the motions, and you're now doing your 2-week proof of concept. Well, how do you get the best value out of the 2 weeks before you either have to commit to a probably 12-month contract that could cost quite a lot of money, or you have to make the justification of why there's better solutions or there's deficits in comparison to your current tooling? So the goal behind designing a framework would be, you'd sit down and you'd scope out all of your requirements. It could be that you've got a gap, A, B, and C. You then have to take a look at the sort of bigger picture of, well, is there any solution that's doing it for less money? I mean, it depends on where you get to, if it's budget or if it's just the technology. If you're in a position where money's not really an issue in your security budget, then that's fantastic. You can start looking at some of the top flight companies and you can start comparing against them. But it all comes down to this documented process where, when you're making a justification to potentially the decision makers or management to try and release the budget, you have this paper trail that will justify each way that it's been carried out and conducted. So the initial scope would be, maybe you've got these 5 key features that you want. It could be that you've got a compliance framework that requires you to monitor for data exfiltration tools. Now, a lot of the time, this would include something like curl, which is, as many of you will know, completely benign most of the time, but could be used to obviously do some malicious things. And there are some frameworks that mandate you monitor for this. Now, it could be a case of you write some dirty bash script that will, every time the command run, it will send off a Slack message or it'll email you. And yeah, that would be great. However, if you're looking at a tool that's obviously going to protect you and offer you the solution that you need, it would be nice to have that as your that's one of the requirements. And then you can compare it against a second tool And at the end of it, you've got these comprehensive and detailed comparisons between maybe 2 or 3 solutions. So the best example I can give is for something like a host intrusion detection system or an XDR platform. Now this is probably it's more the fun one to framework and have like a lot of fun with. So you look at the problem and you define your requirements. So obviously you're going to want to be alerted if there's lateral movement through your network. You're going to be wanting to know if a malicious binary is executed and things like this. And then once you've got this core set of requirements, you would develop a sandbox environment. A lot of the times a proof of concept will be run on, if it's an agent-based one, it'll be like, okay, well, we'll drop it on a select few boxes in our staging environment or our dev environment. And that's beneficial when you want to get the feel for what the deployment's going to be like. Depending on how you're structured, it could be that you've worked with the stakeholders who run the service, such as the infrastructure team. So you know that the deployment's going to go quite smoothly. You know that there's no nuances with the deployment in that it doesn't like another agent that's running on your estate. So this is where you create your own testing sandbox. It could be a very controlled set of 5 servers. It might not even be necessarily in your infrastructure. It could be on any cloud-based provider going. And the idea is you will have a scenario I use for the extended detection and response would be a SSH host. You've probably got a DB server, a storage box, maybe a vulnerable web application and things like that. And you create this, it's almost like a capture the flag scenario. In that after we've seen our demonstration and they've shown us all these amazing features, well, you don't get the full feel for how does it alert me? What can I do to escalate alerts? If it detects at 3 o'clock in the morning, my database is being accessed and there's tables are being copied and things like that. You need to get that feel for how the information is going to be conveyed to you in a way that as soon as you've deployed it and you've gone through the process, you get this alert and you're like, oh, well, what do I do from here? It could be that the alerts only come via email, which is no good when you're using something like Slack or Microsoft Teams. And it could be that there's no real scaling system, so it just alerts everything, or it alerts too easily. So a lot of security tools, depending on the nature of it, something like a runtime detection agent will monitor it for just about anything, and they create a lot of noise. So you have to get that feel for what the noise is going to be like. If you've done the 2-week proof of concept in your development environment or your staging environment, I would hope that it's very, very quiet. It would be very worrying if you've deployed it to a subset of systems and you all of a sudden start getting alerts everywhere because, there's someone inside your network. It would be never nice to find out. So this is where the scenario comes and you have a little bit of fun. So you give like a scenario to maybe a junior member of the team. It could be that you've got a graduate program and you've got some new starters, and it gets that process taken out of the decision maker's hands and it shares it between. You could come in with a biased. So if you've brought this, if you're trying to champion this tool, this process kind of alleviates any bias that you can drive forward, and sometimes that can cause some narrow-sightedness in terms of a solution. It might be that you've been using this vendor for years and you've got a really good reputation with the sales rep, and you want to champion that at your new company. Or it could be that you just really like the product, you've seen it, it looks really interesting, and you're all into it. But again, if you've got a team of people that are all comparing against this framework, it means that you're evaluating 2 or 3 products and you can get the real apples to apples comparison against maybe your top 3 products. And the idea behind it would be you create this sandbox, and I mean with the benefit of infrastructure as code and things like that, you can Terraform your infrastructure deployment, you can Ansible your sort of vulnerable network setup and things, your vulnerable application setup. And once that's all been deployed, it's the next time you do it, it's as simple as dropping a few lines of code and everything will be rebuilt. So it makes it highly reproducible. The red versus blue team scenario is also a really nice one in this sort of space where if you've got a team playing as the red team who are sort of attacking this scenario that you've set up, you as the blue team can then monitor and see how is it alerting me. And that's the premise of it. It's reproducible. I think some places you can get into a rut with a tool, and after a year, the way technology is moving, after a year, it could potentially be the wrong solution now. So if you've got this reproducible documentation, it means that in 6 months to 8 months, when you start to look at the renewal process and things like that, you can pull up your framework and you can test the newest solution completely like for like to the solution that you're currently using. And it means there's no unfair bias to, oh, well, this is just newer. It could be that the solution you found 18 months ago, a year ago, is the best solution. Or it could be that, you know what, there's actually massive deficits that we've noticed, which you can then add to your framework. The ability to add to it in a year's time after you've sort of bedded it in, because there's always nuances with tooling, especially if you're working with some smaller companies or some startups. It could be that the roadmap's not necessarily where they promise to be 12 months down the line. It could be that a company's come up with something completely groundbreaking that would benefit you hugely. It's just this reproducibility of testing that it makes everything a lot easier. The sort of, you can look at it as an IAM analyzer. There's a lot of SaaS-based platforms that will link into your AWS account, for instance. They'll look at 3 months of CloudTrail logs, and they will give you least privilege access configurations based on, you know, which users are interacting with which areas and things like that. Well, that's fantastic. If you take this one tool and go, okay, well, this must be gospel for the least privilege access configuration that they've generated, then it's not completely done your diligence based on the fact that it's just taking one opinion. If you look at some cloud-based providers will have their own role-based analyzer that will generate the best least privilege, but have a look at 2 or 3 solutions, use the same test. It could be, if you're looking at something like a CSPM, create a deliberately vulnerable configuration, something that you know should be flared up, and then compare it against 2 or 3 tooling sets, and you can start to get a feel for it. The idea is to be quite creative and have fun with it. Don't limit yourself. It could be that you're looking at a, as I say, a HID section. You create this capture the flag program. It could be that every year when you come to renew it, and you've got obviously a graduate program, things like that, that could be, okay, well, we're going to trial these new products this year. Let's give the junior members of the team or the new starters this fun, interactive way to get a feel for it. And it becomes a sort of, once you've done the initial grunt work, so to speak, of generating the policy, it becomes a lot easier. I think the creativity here is the sort of key to the idea. If you look at the problem and you want to, you can more or less framework for any type of security tool. An antivirus solution, it could be that you're using a big named antivirus solution and the new kid on the block has come out. Well, you look at a lot of things, budget's obviously one of them, but then once you've done this framework and you've maybe compared 3 or 4 of them apples to apples with a framework, you can go back and you can use that as leverage. The idea to negotiate or haggle almost based on, you're speaking to your vendor, okay, you've done your proof of concept, well, how was it? Oh, well, we've got these deficits, you know, your competitor is doing this slightly better, we feel that this would be a better fit for us. You can get into that point where you can maybe free up some of your budget in the fact that you've highlighted the issues they've got, but at the end of the day, they're still going to want your business. It might not necessarily be the biggest discount going, but there's still that leverage, and you can give them the paper trail, so you can easily compare against 2 different sets. And essentially, you're making this sort of argument for, you've done your due diligence, and once you've done that diligence, it gives you that leverage. The entire premise of the framework is to add this sort of, it's almost like we've got infrastructure as code to create everything reproducible easily. It's reproducible testing for infrastructure tooling. It could be cloud-based solutions. It could be anything. It could be that you're looking at a vulnerability scanner and you've got 3 or 4 on-premise vulnerability scanners, and you're comparing each of them. Which one's finding the latest 0 days? Who's got the most up-to-date news? Where are they looking for this information and things like that? And again, once you've frameworked it out and you've got it all documented, you can notice that there's certain ones that have a massive deficit, or there's some that, while some of the technology that they're using is really good, their user interface is terrible, and it takes someone 3 or 4 hours to try and sort of do anything. The biggest highlight for a framework that I've noticed was with the customization of certain rules. When you're looking at the rules that your sort of security team can generate and create themselves, it depends on obviously the tool and the solution. But personally, I think the more control you have over the like the rules and the alerts, it makes it a lot easier. You can tune out a lot of the noise that you'd otherwise end up hearing. And you can then create the sort of, it makes it useful for you. In some cases, you might open a tool and it has issues where you can't necessarily tweak the rules or turn them off or change the alerts. You can have workarounds and things like that, but you've not got that same level of fine-grained control that you would otherwise have. And I think this is where I've ran a number of proof of concepts in. You've got 2 weeks and you've dropped it on your staging environment. And that's great, you get a feel for everything like that. You have a strong enough opinion to make a justification for, okay, well, this is what's going to keep us safe for the next 12 months. And I think the overview of things, of how does it interact with everything, but you've got this paper trail. So when you go to management and you're asking for, obviously, the budget increase, or maybe it could be that you're trying to move away from something that you've been partnered with for years, you have to make these justifications. And if you can show the exact paper trail and apples for apples, there's not a lot of argument in the discussion. That was a lot quicker than I thought. Any questions?
Unmute. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, you're all very well behaved. It's strange. This is the B-sides, you know. Well, thanks very much. Oh, Chris has got a question. Spicy.
Ah, there you go. Don't know, Mike.
Do you have any examples anywhere of how you have put it on paper to map out some of these differences so that you can measure them out?
So this is one of the sort of fluid sides of it, where there's no right or wrong answer. It could be you've got a very sort of, you write the scenario at the top and you've got tick boxes. It could be that each section you're tested against, you break it down. It would depend on each organisation as to how you want to do it. You could literally do a graph and have, well, okay, this has A, B, and C features. Each one of these has the feature. And it's just this sort of whatever works for the team or whatever works for you. So there's no right or wrong answer, and that's where they sort of get creative with it and just have this documentation that you can reproduce each time. And it's just easy to sort of go back to and be like, a year's time, well, why are we spending all this money on this tool? Well, okay, here's the diligence we've done. We spent 2 weeks, we've tested this fully. We can guarantee at the time this was the best solution for us. Because there's situations where obviously budgets and things come into scrutiny. And if you can give someone this piece of paper that just goes, well, here's all the tests we've done, and here's my justification for why this was the best at the time, it makes it a lot easier to navigate that sort of either renewal process or moving away.
Cool, thank you very much. Everyone give a warm round of applause to Mike.